Renaissance and Enlightenment, right? From Renaissance and Enlightenment. Right. Yes. In this, we know in the age of Renaissance, explorers embarked upon the journeys, adventurers like Columbus, like Vasco da Gama, and they encountered what? People whom they called as what? Other cultures, right? So they focused on studying these other cultures, right? Other cultures. That was their focus. During the age of Enlightenment, again, this was contemporary with the age of colonization, right? Here they also studied these people specifically with the purpose of what? Of being able to administer them properly, right? They started with this. Fine. During the period of evolutionism, during the period of the early age of Enlightenment, which was termed as the age of reason, the age of science, at that time already the evolutionary thought had been developing, right? Evolutionary thought had been developing, one, and comparative studies had already started. Which were the two things which were used by whom? Early evolutionists, right? Early evolutionists. That is why we use the term that when the evolutionists started to frame their theories, we call it as what? Systematic beginning, right? Systematic beginning of the subject. Is it not? We call it as which period? Systematic beginning of this period. And then in this particular period, when we call it as the systematic beginning of the social cultural anthropology, and when came the theory of evolutionism, right? There were three important works that were done by the pioneers. For example, Ancient Law by Henry Maine, Morgan, Ancient Society, and Primitive Culture by E.B. Tyler. All of them emphasize on what? Three stages of cultural evolution, right? And also similar stages of evolution of different social institutions. For example, religion. Tyler talked about what? From animism to polytheism to monotheism, right? Then began in the anthropology an anti-evolutionary thought. बहुत हो गया evolution. Anti-evolutionary thought, right? This started with whom? Franz Boas. His approach was what? His theoretical paradigm was what? Historical particularism, right? Like evolutionists, they were also concerned with what? History as a method. Is it not? They were also concerned with understanding things in a historical perspective. That is how from one stage to this stage we have arrived. That also has an essence of history, but not the history in the sense that we use history, right? Like the chronological sense of history that we know. Is it not? They talked about this. However, Franz Boas was against such kind of interpretation, and he wanted to study these cultures in the context of their own histories. That is, in the context of their particular histories. That is why he termed it as what? क्या बोला उसने? Historical particularism. तो बोलो ना, जबान क्यों ठंडी पड़ जा रही एकदम से? Historical particularism, right? Also, as an anti-evolutionary thought began what? Your diffusionism, right? Because diffusionism did not believe in such kind of evolutionism and also did not believe in the inventiveness of the mankind. They believed that it is invented at one place and from thereupon it diffuses into other parts, right? That was diffusionism. And after Franz Boas, there was Malinowski, there was Radcliffe Brown. Malinowski developed the theory of what? Functionalism. Radcliffe Brown developed the theory of structural functionalism. So when Radcliffe Brown focused on the theory of structural functionalism and the Malinowski's focus on functionalism, this period was said to be what? A paradigm shift in trying to understand social cultural aspects under the social cultural anthropology. Fine. This period is called as what? A paradigm shift. So basically, when we start with the systematic beginning, In this, there is evolutionary thought. There is anti-evolutionary thought, of which the pioneers are diffusionists. Franz Boas was also a diffusionist, but his approach was of what? Historical particularism, also initiated fieldwork tradition. Following that, Malinowski, then Radcliffe Brown. Malinowski, with his participant observation, further magnified the scope of fieldwork, and Radcliffe Brown gave altogether a new approach, which is what? Structure and functionalism, right? While Malinowski gave an approach which is called as what? Functionalism. And this was a period which was highlighted as what? A paradigm shift. Paradigm shift. That is, they were interested in studying what exactly exists now, not in what has happened in the past, right? Anthropology is the study of here and now, not the study of past. Radcliffe Brown says so. Is it not? Now, after this began what? After this began your neo-evolutionism. After this began your neo-evolutionism. Fine. Now, in neo-evolutionism, now as we already know, there was evolutionary thought. There were critiques of evolutionary thought in the form of what? Diffusionists, in the form of your functionalists, in the form of what? Structural functionalists. They all criticized the evolutionary thought process. And the evolutionary thought process was criticized on various aspects. For example, of being ethnocentric in its perspective. One view was that, right? Diffusionists did not believe in what was preached by the evolutionists. They were having a different kind of thought process, right? Franz Boas focused on field work and criticized them for what? Not collecting the data themselves by going into the field and relying on secondary data in the first place. Agree? That was the thought process of whom? Franz Boas. Then Malinowski again expanded the scope of fieldwork. He also criticized the evolutionists for what? Relying on secondary data, being an armchair expert. Fine. So Malinowski, he then did the participant observation, took the fieldwork tradition to the next level. Radcliffe Brown again created this. So all these were what? Basically having an anti-evolutionary orientation. Any doubt in this? That is, they did not align with the thought of evolution of cultures. That was the simple understanding of anti-evolutionary thought. All these paradigms of understanding social cultural anthropology theories highlight that they were anti-evolutionary in their orientation. Why anti-evolutionary? Because they did not believe in the evolutionary scheme of origin and development of cultures. Is the voice echoing? Audible, right? Fine. Then came Neo-evolutionism, right? They thought that they still had the belief in evolutionism. There was a school, right? There were thinkers who believed still in evolutionism, but not in the way in which the early evolutionists had conceived this, right? Early evolutionists had given a which kind of scheme? A unilinear scheme. Which scheme? Unilinear. That is, from this stage of savagery to what? Barbarism. To what? Civilization. Civilization, right? 3 stages, linear. First, second, third. This was their understanding. Now, they tried to understand evolutionism is in a different context. They said that not necessarily the evolution takes place in this unilinear fashion. There can be multiple pathways of evolution. That was their understanding. For example, they gave a very simple example of how institutions evolve, right? So one particular institution might be having initially a particular form. From thereupon, it will transform into very different direction. And from there, it will again come back to its original form, although in a modified version. Although in what? Institution starting from first stage, going into a different direction, coming back to original stage, but in a different form. So they were not in the favor of idea of what? Unilinear. You can conceive it as what? Maybe circular. You can conceive it as what? Circular. That is, an institution started from A, went to a very different direction, B, right? And it might want to come to a original state. So this might be called as what? Circular. However, because it is not coming exactly in the same form as it was initially, so they called it as what? Parabolic evolution. Circular क्योंकि वो when it is starting from one stage, it is not reaching the same stage again. Yes. For example, property. Property, we know people own property, right? So according to them, it started as common ownership. Property was owned by everybody. People living in the hunter-gatherer stage in the forest, they did what? They owned the resources and the property in a common manner. Everybody had equal stake. Everybody was commonly owning the property, right? So started with common ownership. Common ownership. From there upon, it took the direction of what? Individual property or individual ownership or private property. Yes or no? From common ownership, what do you find in the tribes? They own the resources collectively. Yes or no? That is what is understood as what? Common ownership. So they said that it started with common ownership. From there upon, it moved to a second stage, which is what? Individual ownership. Individual ownership. And then state is again trying to bring up the idea of common ownership. Right? State is again trying to bring up what? The idea of common ownership. That is, even when you have individual ownership, but state is the one which is highly dominant on the ownership of land resources. That is, if state has decided to take away your property, it can take away in the larger interest of the society, right? So again, enforcing the common ownership, but in a different form. And if you go to the communist countries, state owns everything, right? We have a doctrine of eminent domain, under which state can acquire any property for public purposes. Public purposes means what? Common ownership. Metro belongs to whom? Common ownership. Everybody has an ownership on that. It does not belong to any individual. It's a common ownership. Public parks, common ownership. Is it not? Right? But they actually belong to the state. But it is again enforcing what? Common ownership only again. Starting from common ownership when there was no state. To what? Individual ownership. To what? Again, common ownership, but in a different form. Related to what? Property. Right? For example, when they talk about mating, and sex in humanity, they say that initial stage was a stage of promiscuity. Promiscuity. That is random mating, no rules. Right? From there, it transformed into what? For evolutionists, it was what? Promiscuity to polygamy to monogamy. They said that maybe it transformed into monogamy, which was basically controlled or regulated mating. Yes? So maybe monogamy or polygamy. So they called it as what? Monogamy. But they say, with progress in present times, people are choosing for what? Sexual freedom. Sexual freedom. Like live-in relationships. Right? Like live-in relationships. That is again coming back, although in a different form. Not in the form in which it was originally happening. So again, now there is a call for what? Sexual freedom. So they call it as what? Parabolic pathway. Had it reached the same stage again, it would have been a circular. So circular would have been a wrong analogy. Agree? Right? So they gave this trajectory of parabolic path. Agree? Common ownership to individual or private property to again common ownership, but in a different form, which is what? Which is owned by state. Yes. For example, sexual promiscuity to maybe regulated mating in the form of what? monogamy to what? Again, sexual freedom. Yes. Another example they take is of what? Clothing. Kungs of Kalahari that we have discussed. They wear minimal clothes, right? So they were wearing very less clothes in the lap of nature that they were living in, right? So very less clothes. Yes, or lack of clothes. Yes, a kind of nudity. That is, people are not wearing clothes because their environment is such. It started as that. Yes. From there upon, the culture transformed into, maybe initially it was lack of clothing. Lack of clothing. To it transformed into full regulated clothing. कि आदमी ये पहनेगा, औरत ये पहनेगी. ओकेजन पे ये पहनना है, शादी पे ये पहनना है. Yes, society controlling everything. Yes or no? And in fact, expecting people to wear clothes, not roam around without wearing clothes. If you happen to be from rural background, if you go to the rural background, in your rural background, you wearing a particular clothes are expected from you. People from different castes are wearing different kinds of clothes also. Is it not? So there's the expectation. For example, if you are roaming around in shorts in villages, people will ask you questions. कि ऐसे क्यों घूम रहे हो भाई? क्या हो गया? Although it is now slowly getting accepted, but this is how it used to be 50 years back, 100 years back. So again, from there, from lack of clothes to second stage of what? To regulated, to maybe expectation of people wearing clothes, right? In European countries, they had elaborate gowns for women, elaborate overcoats and everything, right? So it was basically a second stage. And third stage again is what? Now people are again moving towards what? Wearing skinny clothes. Agree or not? हमारे परिवारों को जो प्रॉब्लम होती है कि टीवी पे जो कल्चर आ रहा है इसमें साथ बैठ के मूवी नहीं देख सकते, right? So again we are witnessing what? Witnessing people again trying to wear minimal clothes. And recently there was a UN cry related to a girl wearing a typical kinds of clothes in Delhi metro. It created a lot of outrage, right? But with individual freedom coming again, individualism taking its place, people are now choosing their alternatives. Yes, in foreign countries, when there are protests, there are naked protests. Yes or no? So they say nudism is again coming, right? From thereupon, nudism is again coming. So not necessarily the pathway that the culture follows is unilinear. It can have multiple pathways, right? And there have been thinkers of the neo-evolutionary thought. This is a very basic understanding of it to explain how it is not unilinear. And then there have been different thinkers who have thought of it in a very different style. Getting it? For example, some explain that, Leslie White explains that culture transforms based on what? Based on the amount of energy that is exploited by the particular culture. For example, hunter-gatherers were using what? Minimal energy. Yes, minimal energy means what? Now, unke paas bijli thi. They did not have the technology of coal-based power plant. At best, they were using fire as a very basic type of energy, right? Then it transformed to the next stage where exploitation of energy started. For example, your wheel was evolved. People using carts to transform. And then we reach the stage of civilization where we are exploiting energy extensively, fossil fuels, coal, right? So his evolutionary scheme was based on the exploitation of energy by a typical culture, right? So there are different thought processes in the neo-evolutionary thought also. Now you have a basic idea of it, how it is different from the early evolutionary thought. Yes. Now here they also had this idea that when they developed this kind of thought process, they always talked about empirical evidence. Like the previous ones did not have empirical evidence, they talked about empirical evidence to make it more scientific. Yes or no? आया समझ में बेसिक एकदम, राइट? सो राइट इट डाउन. Neo-evolutionism, 1940s.